Hi, I'm Liza Schmidt, editor and investigator at Insight Crime, and today we're going to talk about Ecuador. On February 9th, Ecuador went to the polls for the first round of the 2025 presidential elections. There were 16 candidates on the ballot, but the two main contenders, incumbent Daniel Noboa and challenger Luisa González, far outstripped the rest, winning about 44% of the vote each. Noboa and González will compete in a second round vote in April. This election is taking place in the midst of surging levels of violence in the country. But for years, Ecuador was the envy of the region. While its neighbor Colombia faced seemingly never-ending crime and violence, Ecuador had some of the lowest homicide rates in the world, attracted tourists and economic investment, and was putting its oil revenue into social and economic programs, some of which benefited demobilized gang members looking to start a new life. Now, however, Ecuador is a poster child for how quickly things can turn in the other direction. Today, I'm speaking with Steven Dudley, co-director of Insight Crime, about how the situation in Ecuador will shape the country's elections and the two candidates' stances on security and crime, as well as the challenges facing the future president. Welcome, Steven.
Thanks, Liza.
To start off, Ecuador has been facing an unprecedented security crisis for the last few years, putting this issue at the forefront of the candidates' platforms. How did a country that was known for years as one of the most stable and safe in Latin America get to this point? What changed?
There are a lot of answers to that question, as you can imagine. Most people, including ourselves, start with the prison system. There is and has been a crisis inside of the prison system for many, many years as it relates to security and the development of organized crime. The way that it has evolved in Ecuador, as it has in other countries around the region, is that these groups, really the strongest groups in Ecuador, began inside the prison system. They weren't always involved with drug trafficking. In fact, the most famous of them, which is called the Choneros, was more closely associated with things like car theft and assassination for hire and those sorts of activities before their leadership was imprisoned. They were imprisoned during a specific time period in which the prison population was growing because of government policies, and during a time period in which Ecuador was increasingly used as a transit zone for cocaine. Cocaine production in neighboring countries like Colombia, principally Colombia, because it's produced obviously also in Peru and Bolivia, but mostly Colombia, was the amount of cocaine that was moving from Colombia through Ecuador and into new markets, often to Europe and Asia, was also going up exponentially. So at the same time, you had these prison gangs and leadership emerging inside the prisons. You had a new and really lucrative criminal economy emerging inside of Ecuador, something that really wasn't existing or in existence prior to that. So this is what kind of laid the groundwork for what we see now in Ecuador, which is a battle amongst these prison gangs, or at least mostly prison gangs. There's a mixture of them now, and they've kind of atomized since their beginnings. But mostly what we're seeing in Ecuador is a battle amongst these different, what they often refer to there in Ecuador, very simply, but usefully, as mafias, and a battle amongst them, and this is what has pushed the country to crisis levels of violence and criminality that, in many instances, or to many analysts, threaten the state. These threats manifest in many ways, but the most relevant of them, as it pertains to this discussion, is during elections themselves. Loads of threats and attacks on politicians, not as bad perhaps as we saw in the previous presidential elections, which included the assassination of one of the candidates. But this is how a very simple explanation of how we got to where we are.
So you mentioned the choneros as one of the groups involved in this battle, as you described it. What are some of the other Ecuadorian groups that are involved? And also, are there transnational organized crime groups that are contributing to this situation in Ecuador?
There are a number of groups now involved. They've number well over a dozen at this point. It was kind of consolidated to a certain extent under many of them were sort of brought in under the Choneros umbrella at first, which had created an alliance of sorts, which allowed them to operate in a large geographic space and be the sort of masters of their domain for a while. These other groups and these alliances, however, broke apart. They broke apart for a lot of reasons. There were there are always fights over money. There are petty jealousies. Certainly, control of some prisons is more important than control of others. So you see, for a series of reasons, they break up, and these other groups, these segments that had formed part of this alliance, start to break out. They go by names like Los Lobos, so the wolves, Tiguerones, the tigers, and then there are others that maybe even at some point paid homage to the choneros. So there's one called the Chone Killers, which was a remnant of a street gang before, and it became an armed wing of the choneros. And then you have others that are more traditional, considered more traditional street gangs, like the Latin Kings, that had a presence in Ecuador and to a certain extent predated and were really blamed for much of the violence that was happening pre-mafia stage. So this was sort of the prior to this uptick in cocaine trafficking and the movement of so much big underworld money going through the country. So you've got a mixture of different groups that have different histories, and some of them have very different criminal economies as well. Some of them, move very fluidly in the cocaine world, and they are very much entrenched in the cocaine trafficking world, and others are much more about selling drugs on a local level, or maybe assassination for hire, maybe just extortion at this stage. So there's a wide variety of criminal economies that have also emerged over time, especially as these groups have fragmented and these pieces have broke off. And what they do is they get involved increasingly in these criminal activities that have lower barriers of entry. And so that's where you get a massive uptick in things like extortion. Extortion in Ecuador is rampant, historic. They've never faced down this problem, and it comes as these different parts of these groups break off and are seeking ways to continue to make money. And one of the easiest ways to make money is extorting.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned actually the last election in 2023, and Noboa has only been president for a little more than a year, following a very unusual situation where the former president, Guillermo Lasso, used a constitutional mechanism to call early elections to avoid being impeached. So in 2023, during those elections, when Noboa was first elected, running against González, actually, that election was incredibly violent. And you mentioned one candidate, Fernando Villavicencio, who was assassinated by alleged gang members in August that year. How do the levels of violence compare in this election, and what do you think we'll see in the coming months ahead of the second round?
Well, it's slightly lower levels of violence. There's obviously the candidates were a little bit more prepared. What you have over time are obviously the country, the individual campaigns, political parties. They have to ramp up their security, and this is a sad reality that Ecuador has had to face. The reality in all of these places is that the local candidates, the ones going for municipal posts, and very often mayors are the ones that are most frequently targeted. They are the most vulnerable. They do have very often control over certain aspects of life, and that includes economic life, that these criminal groups want to control themselves, whether it's positioning or opening up doors for authorities, or maybe opening up doors for business relationships, so municipal contracts or state contracts for all kinds of things, to launder money, or so there are lots of reasons why these particular politicians on the local level get targeted, and it's very often difficult to discern why they were targeted as well, because most of these investigations never end up prosecuting anybody, unlike the Villavicencio one, where we actually did have some prosecutions. They did lay some blame on the Lobos, that had allegedly used these Colombian mercenaries, but the mercenaries were subsequently assassinated inside prison. So you get a lot of conspiracy theories about these types of attacks as well. So it's hard often to discern who is who, even when you have these violent attacks.
Yeah, and with this rise in violence, and especially the attacks on a local level for politics, for local politicians, this has really impacted citizens' perception of safety and security. There have been studies about how it has plummeted during the last year under Noboa. How has he ramped up the fight against organized crime? He most notably declared an internal armed conflict against the country's gangs in January 2024. But what other actions has his government taken, and how effective have they actually been?
What Noboa has done more than anything else is illustrate that he's willing to use everything at his disposal to deal with organized crime. And when I say that, I mean principally the military. So he's willing to trot out the military and put it on the streets, have it be a part of the security perimeter of prisons, as they are, and they remain really the epicenter of much criminal activity. Use the military to affect raids inside prisons, to what they claim to be retaking control of these particular important spaces for criminal activity. There is certainly at least rhetoric around going after corruption. So obviously pushing, without necessarily having complete control over, but pushing the judicial system to take more direct action against corrupt politicians. That's not necessarily under his control, although some people think that he's increasingly trying to get it under his control, but that's a whole nother debate. But nonetheless, certainly putting an emphasis on going after corrupt actors. The reality, though, is that most of this is leading to short-term results, not long-term results. So you may have a dip, which we did in homicides at the onset of this campaign, this militarized and punitive campaign. And we did see an uptick in the amount of arrests, for example, they went way up from previous years. So certainly there were an increased amount of presence and also increased amount of arrests. We do have to say that, but you had the initial dip, but then over time, as they move around to other parts of the country, the criminal groups adjust to their presence. They figure out new ways to, operate. They atomize for a series of reasons. You get violence on the uptick again. By the end of the year, we're back to similar levels of homicides per month. And in some respects, I think during January, there were the most homicides in a January that the country has ever registered. So January 2025 is marking a moment where we are back to where we started. So you could say these are things that are completely for show, which many analysts said to me when I was working on the story. I don't know if I completely agree with that, but that's certainly one perspective. And I think another, which is perhaps more important for the long haul, is that there isn't any real effort to go after the systemic problems, the institutional problems. So you can certainly send the military in to do raids in prisons, but if you don't reform the prison system, which is the epicenter of criminal activity, then you're not going to get at the heart of what is driving this crisis. And that is the real core of the criticism of Noboa, that nothing is substantive, nothing is deep. There isn't any institutional effort to deal with crime.
I understand as well that there are some criticisms of human rights violations underneath the sort of militarized approach that Noboa has taken. Certainly a popular approach in the region with Bukele in El Salvador, immensely popular for his mano dura approach. What have been the criticisms from the human rights perspective, but also praise or criticism from the public perspective for the efforts that Noboa has put forward?
The criticisms of the with regards to human rights are mostly directed at the way in which the military has administered, let's just say, the prisons. And the thing that you have to understand about the military, any military, is they're not trained necessarily to be police forces. They don't have these the typical training that police would have. I'm not saying it works all the time with police either, but that police would have as it relates to how to deal with the community, how to deal with an arrest, how to allow for or create the opportunity for due process, even when people are being arrested. And they're used to a much more punitive approach, which can include abuse. And for many, mostly the criticism most systematically came from the international community, but also from internally, things like torture. So how do you get what you want? You torture people. So there have been a lot of I would say critiques and some of it documentation about numerous cases. Human Rights Watch did a report. Insight Crime cataloged our own series of abuses that we had heard about directly from some of the victims or victims' families. So, and many other groups locally in Ecuador, obviously, who really are the ones who began to spread this idea of what was happening inside of the prisons, also talked about this. So this was a groundswell and obviously a worrying trend. There is an element of this that has, I think, somewhat seeped into the presidential campaign, and that's related to a case from early December when an Air Force unit that was patrolling in a poor neighborhood in Guayaquil, which is the industrial hub and one of the epicenters of criminal activity in Ecuador, stopped 11 kids who were coming back from playing soccer. 7 of them ran off. 4 of them were picked up by this unit. They were subsequently disappeared. They were gone. Their families couldn't find them for days and days until about a week later, a little bit more than a week. Their four bodies were found. They weren't immediately identified, and then a week later, they were identified as the 4 kids. The government in the interim and parts of the military denied they had anything to do with it. That it wasn't related to them. That it was criminal groups. That they had dropped the kids off again after they'd captured them. The case is still under investigation, but the point that came out in the elections was how little President Noboa had responded in public to this, and how much deference he had given to potential abuses of the military in such a blatant and wanton fashion. There were videos, there were screams over telephones, so recorded telephone calls that were talked about in this case. Again, this case is under investigation. We don't know exactly what happened, but it certainly points towards a very troubling state abuse of their power, at the very least, and at the very most, perhaps even murder. So this is something that has bubbled up. In the campaign itself, the thing about it was, and this speaks to Ecuador's current environment right now, is that none of the other candidates really attacked the military either for this case. They attacked Noboa for not doing anything, but they also let the military off the hook in many regards. They didn't make any strong statements against the military, even during the only presidential debate we had pre the first round of the elections. So this is the environment in which Ecuador finds itself. There's no room to go against the military, to go against the idea of, mano dura or strong hand tactics to face down organized crime right now. And there's very little space for talk about human rights or human rights violations.
Wow. So with that in mind, then what strategies and policies have the 2 candidates, Noboa and González, proposed? What are the differences or the sort of different angles that they're taking for attacking this issue, which is so at the forefront of everyone's mind?
There is very little daylight between these candidates. Most of the candidates start out with this idea of they are going to implement some form of mano dura or hardline policies. Every single one of them across the board. So you have 16 candidates. Each of them have their own version of mano dura. So they start from that notion. There is a much wider spectrum of possibilities under a Luisa González presidency than there is, at least from what we hear from the rhetoric, in a Daniel Noboa presidency. Luisa González comes from a political tradition that is much more open to funding things that are more holistic, or integral is the word that is used as it relates to security concerns in Ecuador.
Can you give an example?
So more social programs, opening up spaces for sporting activities or micro lending, education or annexes to educational activities, job training, those kinds of things. This is something that the party that she's associated with, the citizens' revolution would be the translation uh, that party is associated with. It implemented a lot of these programs early on when one of the earlier presidents, Rafael Correa, was in office. So there is a lot more tradition there. There's a lot more openness on that side to these kinds of integral approaches, but we don't know how many resources will be dedicated to that. We don't know if the emphasis will remain simply on the hardline side, and if the rest of it will just get sort of the rhetoric, but none of the financial or human resources that are needed to really make a difference.
Regardless of who wins, since right now the public has them as pretty even in the vote count, what do you think are the biggest organized crime challenges that the future president will face?
The organized crime challenges there are immense. You have to start with the fact that they cannot control the macroeconomic factors that have led to the crisis. They're not in Colombia. They're not suppressing the cocaine flow or production, I should say, in places like Colombia, where it is at record levels year after year. The amount of cocaine that is being produced in the Andean region is breaking records. So that's out of their control. The other part that it's out of their control is that these groups are atomizing, that these groups are getting involved in these local criminal economies that didn't necessarily exist before. So extortion is probably the most notable one, and anyone who takes the presidency has to deal with extortion, almost more so than violence. Certainly, they can go hand in hand, but extortion is something that is just walloping the country right now. So that is that kind of very basic challenge right there. To deal with something at the ground level like extortion is going to be a giant challenge. And then they have to go after these more systemic challenges. Of course, we've already mentioned the prisons, but there are others. And the one that I would note that is going to be very difficult is the judicial branch. This is a judicial branch that routinely lets prisoners out for reasons that are very questionable. And there are lots of question marks around many judges. And there is a need to perhaps address this. But how do you address this if you're the president and you're also trying to maintain the independence of the various branches of government? There's a lot of fear that there will be, no matter who the president is, they will use the crisis to overstep their power. This is something that we see all over the world. And when the presidency can take over things such as the judicial branch, we know the dangers there. They can weaponize it to make sure that their rivals, enemies, whatever they deem as people who are against them, face all kinds of pressures. And this is something that's extremely dangerous. So while you have these very acute needs, such as addressing the crisis inside prisons or in the judicial branch, you also have to be weary of what happens in the long term if there's a lot of then control of by the presidency over these other parts of the government. So this is a tricky time. It's a tricky thing. It's a tricky balance to reach.
Absolutely. Is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up, Steven?
Well, I think that Ecuador is is obviously not the only country that is going through this challenge, and that even though we have a country with perhaps a slightly more nuanced history as it relates to security strategies, what we are seeing is that the same patterns that we see in other places as it relates to what kind of security strategies are put on the table in front of the populace during things like campaigns have become just increasingly limited. And I would expect that to go forward. In spite of all kinds of data and in our deeper understanding of how crime works and how crime fighting works, the solutions that are put on the table remain very small. The number of solutions that are put on the table in front of the public remain very small, and that is an unfortunate reality that we can see all over the region.
Thank you, Steven.
Thank you, Liza.
Insight Crime will continue to monitor the situation in Ecuador for our readers and listeners, so follow us on social media and sign up for our newsletter on our website to stay updated with our ongoing coverage. For more on this topic, check out Steven's recent article, How Organized Crime Set the Agenda for Ecuador's Presidential Elections, and Insight Crime's recent panel discussion in Spanish, analyzing the candidates' proposed security policies. Thanks for listening.